Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Jenny Stuber, who's a sociologist and an educator at the University of North Florida. She's written publications in her field on urban sociology, social class differences, and sociology of higher education and other institutions, and currently has some publications on the way. For a portion of this interview, we will go over Dr. Stuber's background, her education, and her research, and what she specializes in. And later, we'll touch on the current state of higher education within the United States. Some of what we'll focus on will be how the public perception of higher education has been shaped by things like anti-intellectual rhetoric, and how progressives, if at all, have pushed back on that successfully. We touch a little bit on the changes of the student body over the years in higher education, and what Dr. Stuber's advice would be to anyone going into her field of sociology. Here's some insight into the world of higher education through the lens of sociologist Dr. Jenny Stuber. Okay, cool. So I'll give you the opportunity to go into your background, kind of research you did, what you did your dissertation on, and kind of how you've gone towards now educating.
So let me see where to start. I guess I've been a professor at the University of North Florida for 18 years. I started at the University of North Florida at 2006. In 2006, that's the same year that I finished my PhD. I have only ever studied sociology, so that was my undergraduate major, and then I went into a graduate school at that time. I would say that the area of expertise that is most near and dear to me is anything related to socioeconomic inequality, so class differences and class differences within society. I've used that as a jumping off point to initially explore class differences and inequality within higher education, so among college students. And then I also have an interest in urban sociology and within communities and how inequality gets built into or resisted within cities, communities, neighborhoods, and so forth.
I've noticed a lot with the particularly social sciences staff. He focuses heavy on research. I don't think people really understand. I think a lot of people take sociology, much like other social sciences, a little less seriously than your hard sciences, like your STEM, your math, your engineering majors. But I think it's really important for people to know the fields of sociology can be just as rigorous. So you have professors who are publishing papers and doing research. If there's any research that you've had in the past that's been particularly like your favorite that you've done so far, or any publications that you kind of want to put out there and be like, hey, this was something I worked on that I'm proud of, or
I love all of my publications. They're my babies, I guess you could say. I'm proud, I'm pleased to say that I've published 5 books. My sixth book, I should say, is going to be coming out in a year or so. Some of the books that I've worked on are textbooks, and they're books that I authored or wrote entirely on my own. So I've written introduction to sociology textbooks, or 2 different introduction to sociology textbooks, one of which is in the process of being developed right now. And higher education, or sociology of education, I should say, textbooks too. And that's just a totally different style of writing that is in some ways fun and liberating, and really requires you to survey the field and become an expert in the field as a whole. And I think that is exciting and an obligation and an honor to be able to do that. And then I also have 2 books which are called ethnographies. And those are books that are based on like data I've collected, and they're more in-depth projects. And so I have a different relationship to those works because, they're my own creation from beginning to end, rather than my assessment of the literature and the field overall. So my first book focused on inequality within higher education, and it's called Inside the College Gates. It's rare for books to sell or for people to make money off of their books in sociology, but I've made money off of all of my books in sociology. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're selling tens of thousands of copies, but they're selling decently. Another metric or measure that we pay attention to is what's called like a citation count or a citation index. And my work is very well regarded in terms of the citation. So other scholars reading it or assigning it in their classes. That's a different measure or metric. And then my most recent book, I guess you could say my most recent ethnography, is an exploration of economic inequality in Aspen, Colorado. And for those who don't know, Aspen, Colorado, it has the most expensive real estate market in the entire United States, and has one of the highest levels of inequality in the United States. And I examined how and why it works and doesn't work, depending upon the circumstance.
Yeah, I actually lived in Colorado for about 2 years. So I feel that very personally. Completely different level of like tuition. When you were in college figuring things out, what made you go, this is the field that I want to get into? What made you decide?
Yeah, there's sort of the overarching theme, which is that I came out of high school as a person interested in the social sciences. But that's pretty broad. It was broad in terms of which social science I was interested in. And then it was super, super open ended in terms of what I wanted to do with my social science knowledge. And I think at the time when I was 18, 19, 20, I probably thought that I would be applying my social science knowledge either in law or in banking or making money. And that was a rude awakening when I went to college, and really motivates my whole interest, not just in sociology, but in the specific areas within sociology, is that tuition at my university right now that I attended is $90,000 a year with room and board. It was one of those schools where 40 to 50% of the students were coming from the top 1% of the income distribution. It wasn't probably that exclusive at the time, but it was still a very exclusive campus. And as I mentioned in class yesterday, 45 to 50% of the students were enrolled and involved in Greek life. So it was a really, really, really wealthy environment. And for so long, and probably even sort of still to this day, I wanted to pass within that environment. I wanted to join that environment. I wanted to consider myself and become elite and consider myself as among the elite. I wanted the finer things in life. I wanted them both materially, and I wanted access to those things symbolically. But I really realized that in order to be not just in an elite society, but of an elite society, you need a lot more resources than just graduating, being smart and graduating from a good university. So the people that I went to school with had multi-generational access to higher education, multi-generational access to elite higher education, multi-generational access to wealth. And even though I was in the same environment, I wasn't of the same environment. And it was that dynamic or duality that I just wanted to study, is like, how does social mobility happen and how does social mobility not happen? To what degree do social classes intersect? And then where do they stop intersecting? And how does that work?
We focus on this a lot, where class divides are of the biggest divides within access to quality education, within graduation rates or acceptance rates or anything like that. What do you think? And this is probably a very hard to answer question. I'm sure that's what your entire field is answering the question of what's one way that we could work towards branching that? Because we talk about that a lot. We talk about things like affirmative action or things like tuition discounts or things, that are meant to do those things and sometimes aren't super successful. But what would you say would be something that you hope to see?
Yeah, I think it's super disappointing that we know a lot of things that work, but we don't have the spine or the backbone as a society to implement those policies consistently. So one thing that looks like it works, I mean, there's evidence that it works, is in those handful of states that have had challenges to their school funding models. We've seen that the social class gaps have shrunk in those states where there's been legal challenges to their school funding models. So we know that, like, two of the variables that most impact student learning are access to quality teachers, which is more and more elusive in this day and age, and small class sizes, which are also more and more elusive these days, because those are two really expensive things. And they're also playing themselves out within a context where there's decreasing support for public education of any kind. There's, I think, maybe 15 states where there's been legal challenges to the state funding models because states fund their schools disproportionately out of local property taxes. That's going to inherently lead to a lot of inequities. And in those states that have taken legal challenges along those lines, we've seen that the achievement gap across class lines has shrunk. So that's just one example of, like, on the policy level. On a practical level, it gets a little dangerous and interesting, because the practical level, or I guess I should say on the individual level, a thing that could be done would be poor parents and working class parents raising their kids in ways that are more similar to middle class parents. And that is problematic because it has this cultural deficit model. It's like, well, we just need that lower income kids to acquire the same kinds of cultural capital that upper income kids have access to. And I think that's true, but it's also a short-term solution, and it's not a massive structural solution. But for example, if parents read to their kids more or talked to their kids more or provided them with that kind of verbal stimulation and exposure to the outside world on an individual level, that would matter given the fact that schools generally operate according to middle class norms and styles and cultural standards. So it's a real difficult kind of conversation to have, is like, are the macro level solutions feasible? Is anybody embracing those macro level solutions? And then what are the problematic aspects of the micro level solutions in terms of changing family practices, when we know they could be more effective, but they also come with a lot of baggage in terms of claiming that poor people's cultural styles are deficient?
It's like the placing the blame. It's, we talk about that a lot, that neoliberal ideology of
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
well, you can do it if you just change enough of what you do. If you just like go throughout this in the proper way, you
Yeah.
can achieve this American dream. You can get this American education and, you know, become successful on your own. It's kind of a hard line to teeter on. But what do you think overall, generally? Because a lot's happened in the last few weeks in the US, particularly, and we won't get into politics too much, or as much as you feel comfortable with doing so. What do you think the overall attitudes towards higher education is toward in the United States at the moment, just rhetoric wise on a broader scale?
I think it's one in which higher education is most definitely under attack. I think the election of President Trump is sort of a referendum on that, or a statement from the general public of feeling talked down to and demeaned and not valued. That's important. And to the extent that it's true, it should be taken seriously, that working class people and large numbers of Americans do not feel recognized or valued. I think that rhetoric is partially true, but it's also been harnessed and weaponized, that higher education is a bastion of the elites. That's not the world I work in on an everyday basis. And to apply sort of what is perceived as a cultural model of Yale and Princeton, et cetera, to what happens at most state colleges and universities, it doesn't match up. And most people are just sort of like normal people hoping to promote social mobility and practical job related skills and employment ability, even if we are like generally bringing a more progressive outlook. I mean, we don't look like the caricatures, I think, that have been drawn of us in terms of who we are and what we're trying to accomplish. But yeah, I do think we're in a moment where that those allegations have been very, very successful, because there are, in fact, millions and millions of Americans who are feeling disenfranchised. And it's a tragedy to me. Well, there are so many tragedies to me. One, a tragedy is that progressives haven't figured out any way to rebut this or any way to engage in constructive dialogue. And it's also a tragic to me in the sense that I think the people who are good at promoting this narrative are really good at unifying people through division. So they're pitting the wrong people against each other. I think there's a lot of demonization of poor people against even poorer people, or Black people against browner people, or whatever it is. And that sells, and it's very persuasive, and yet it takes one's eye off of where the real action is. And I think that's a problem, and it's a huge problem that the progressive forces have not been able to counter or resist.
Because it's easy to look at it as like a classified in the sense of like, well, it's the rich versus the middle class and the poor, or, you know, the poor versus the rich, or the upper class versus the lower class. But when you said that, you said it's the poor versus the poorer. It's the Black versus the brown, or the brown versus the browner, because that is, I think, how the climate overall is right now. In fact, we were just talking about this with Dr. Grant about how there's these boundary lines that people draw. Even if those boundaries don't really exist, it's a way to like unify themselves against something else and go, no, I'm not like that though. I'm totally different. I would never do these things, but you never really know until you're put into those types of situations. I think you hit the nail on the head there, that it's just progressives have done a really poor job with mitigating those things. They've done a poor job with mitigating the type of rhetoric that's being used, or things like book bans, like here in the state of Florida, which I think are absolutely abhorrent and very fascist and very, very scary to deal with. I think there's been a lot going on policy-wise to talk about abolishing the Department of Education. Or I think recently on the ballot 2 weeks ago, there was a measure to make school board elections partisan, to where they would have to disclose whatever party that they're affiliated with. How do you think things like the talk about abolishing the Department of Education, or making school board elections partisan will affect higher education overall in the US?
Yeah, I'll go with the first one, I think. And I can't claim to have as much expertise as I should, given the degree of publishing I've done in the area of education. But there's two important caveats to put into the conversation, as far as I understand it, when it comes to federal involvement in education. And the first piece of information, I don't know if it's a caveat, but the first piece of information is that a typical school district's budget, only 5% of it comes from federal tax sources. So on the one hand, we can easily say the federal government already has very little role in education, especially from a funding level. That's just not a role that they have historically played at all. And so that's the side of the equation where somebody could sort of minimize the claims, the threats that the Department of Education would be canceled or abolished, because a typical school district receives only 5% of its funds from federal sources. And there's not that much curricular development or hiring or firing or anything that comes down from the federal government. However, those sources are a larger proportion of budgets in poorer districts. So if there is some type of move to abolish the Department of Education, from a financial standpoint, that's going to hit poorer districts more so. And I forget what the title is. It's like Title One schools or something like that.
Yeah.
And there's all of this legislation that provides additional resources to schools that qualify for this. What is ironic about this, and I saw this from a post, and I could send it to you if need be. I saw this on a post from my colleague, Rick Phillips, on his Facebook page. The irony here is that even though we think about poor districts as being urban districts, they are disproportionately rural districts.
Yes.
So, and then we get to the kind of conclusion, or the observation rather, that it could be lower income districts in Oklahoma that are going to suffer. It's lower income districts in Montana and North Dakota that are going to suffer. It's rural districts in a beloved red state that are going to suffer. And I'll bring that in, is like they are disproportionately dependent on some of these Department of Education Title I funds. And then you start to wonder where the policy knowledge is among these geniuses. And then you start to gain confidence that they really don't have the policy knowledge and they're not geniuses. And then you start to think that maybe they will realize the consequences of what they are suggesting and not actually end up doing them. But I put nothing past these people. So I actually don't know that they will ever have an awakening or a reckoning with what the consequences of their policy would be. I put nothing past them. But you can kind of point out these ironies, these paradoxes, these contradictions, and wonder what the hell do people have in mind once they realize what the consequences are.
It's scary, I think, especially I'm sure for educators, because you're kind of sitting here like, okay, well, what am I supposed to do about this? What, it's the anti-intellectual rhetoric that like reinforces itself. Is the more that they can convince people, that this is a tool for the elites, education is useless, education's a scam, college is a scam. We talked about that pretty in depth, and I know we'll talk about it more. The more that they perpetuate that, the more that gets taken out of education, and that gets pulled away. All the funding gets pulled away, more regulations come in. You said that progressives have done a really poor job at mitigating this, and I think that's been felt a lot by people within the last 2 weeks, that just generally progressives, rhetoric wise and overall, have done a really poor job with pushing a message and making it likable and making it digestible. What do you think people can do to push back against things like book bans and retracting funding from education and things like that? What do you think the most effective way to stop that is? No idea.
I don't know. I do think, I don't know if this is the answer, but there are organizations like PEN America. There are organizations like the ACLU, and they fight on our behalf. So both of those are organizations. PEN America in particular is an organization, nonpartisan, interested in providing free speech and protecting free speech within educational spaces. ACLU does broad work advocating for American civil liberties. those organizations are doing the work of lobbying behind the scenes. They're the ones who are initiating lawsuits and putting holds on legislation, and they're doing important work. So I can't necessarily say whether one should like make a monthly contribution to these organizations or pursue an education that allows them to work in these organizations someday. But there's hope to me at this moment. I don't know how strong it is that there are still players in the space who, when it comes down to legal battles, there's still ammunition that they're working with. There's still valid ammunition that they're working with. I don't know how long that will last, and especially as the court cases rise up to additional levels and move from states to the U.S. Supreme Court, I don't know. But I think that at this moment there are, I don't want to say enough, but there are legal roadblocks and tools that really important organizations have at their disposal, which means that some of the things that have been, I guess, threatened haven't really come to pass. I'll do full stop right there and see where that goes.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I think, like you said, you put it perfectly. There is an attack on higher education and education generally, like you said, because this isn't just affecting colleges and universities. It's not, there's not just book bans on, your local state colleges. There's book bans on elementary schools and high schools where they can't read books about, I think there was one recently, like Rosa Parks. Apparently that's too controversial now to put in high schools, which is very, very concerning to me, to say the least, overall. I guess going back to generally the field of sociology, and especially like right now what you're doing, sociology of higher education, if there was something about the field that you would either want people to know, if there is some other focus that you would like to see people pay attention to more in higher education, like sociology of higher education generally, whether that be with teaching or whether that be with research itself, like you're like, hey, this is something that's not being looked at, I want people to pay attention to this thing.
I actually think I don't have critiques of it. I think it's a hugely generative, hugely exciting field that has gone where it has needed to go, and scholars have pushed it into crevices that they needed to push it. I should also differentiate the study of higher education could be seen as different than the sociological study of higher education. And because I am a diehard sociologist, I have lots and lots of love and appreciation for the sociological study of higher education. And I think we've done a good job. I'm going to, of course, pat ourselves on the back of trying to recalibrate what it is that the study of higher education should be about. Because for so long, it was about just access, completion, access, retention, completion, like really, really basic statistical indicators. Who's going to college, who's staying in college, who's finishing college, who's going to college, who's staying in college, who's finishing college. And I would characterize that as some of the larger preoccupations of the study of higher education. And I'll call that like, there's been a lot of preoccupation with the vertical differentiation in terms of who has more. So vertical is like high levels of education, medium levels, and low levels of education. And sociologists kind of came into the equation and said, we've been studying maybe things the wrong way and focused way too much on discrete quantifiable outcomes. And there's so much more that happens in higher education that doesn't even necessarily have to do with obtaining a degree. Like it's where you develop.
Yeah.
It's where you connect and where you socialize. Like there's so much happening there that we should look at the identity formation that's happening there. So I actually really think that the 20 years that I've been involved in the field, the 25 years that I've been involved in the field, it's just moved in really rich directions rather than ones that have been characterized by blind spots.
I think one of my initial perceptions talking about sociology of higher education was that it was going to be that approach of who goes to college, who graduates college, like, what can we do financially to support colleges? But it's, in a lot of the discussions, become about the student as a whole or the professors as a whole and what's going on with those people when they're interacting every day. It's not just, what degrees earn the most or what degrees don't earn the most and what you should go to college for and what you shouldn't maybe go to college for. And is it for everybody? It's been more nuanced than that.
Yeah. It's surprisingly fun.
I think that's really important too, because when we talk about like who goes to college. It's easy to say or to have this mentality of like, well, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Okay, well, there's a reason people of color attend college at lower rates. There's a reason they graduate at even lower rates. These aren't just things like it certainly can't just be explained away by, well, this population just doesn't want to. This population doesn't have a desire to. Because of course they do. That's so,
Yeah.
and I think providing that really rich like nuance and context to those things really helps, and I think will be really beneficial to like shaping policy going forward with education. And I'm really hoping that just generally in the future I see more people get interested in that type of thing, is to get more people interested into fields like sociology, where they can say, wait, no, we like, this is not a good idea, we shouldn't be cutting funding, we shouldn't, we should be encouraging people to want to learn things and build a better philosophy about life, because it is a public good. Education benefits everybody when everybody has access to it. Speaking of the learning about the student populations as a whole, what have you noticed over your years of teaching about the students that you've engaged with and differences in them? But what have you kind of learned just from being in that one-on-one setting with students?
So my overall scope spans, I think, 25 years, I guess, is the time period, roughly, maybe even more, in which 25 to 30 years, whoa, in which I've been teaching in higher education. So my first courses I taught in 1997, which was so long ago, and that spans to today in 2024. So that is a long time to characterize students. I'll start with where they are ideologically, and I will add, before I kind of give my big takeaway, is that I've taught students in Minnesota, I've taught students in Indiana, I've taught students in Florida, I've taught students when I was a graduate instructor in Rhode Island. And I would say that generally speaking, over time, students in general have become more progressive. It's been easier to convince students that the things I care about are important. So economic inequality is probably the biggest one. Is that 20 years ago, it would have been occasionally a battle to convince some students that inequality is bad. There's still going to be people who think that inequality is necessary and inequality is good and equality is bad. Okay, yeah, we can have that conversation. But I think there is a degree of terror that young people live with today that they didn't live with 25 years ago. And it's that sort of terror in the reality of adulting. And I know that word gets thrown around a lot. Like, that's real. That is very real. I'll expand upon that. So one of the things I've seen is that students in general have become more progressive in their views, and not all of them, and not on every single issue. Then I would add to that, unlike a lot of people, I am not a cynic when it comes to students. And maybe I'm not a cynic when it comes to my students in particular, but I don't think they're lazy. I don't think that they're programmed to cheat. I don't think that's their first line of approach when they approach an assignment is to cheat. I think highly of students. I don't think they're grade grubbers. I don't think that they're entitled. I really think collectively that students, and that could be UNF students and that could be my students, are just great humans trying to get by. And that hasn't necessarily changed. It's just the deep faith I have in students and how much so many of them actually want to learn, actually want to participate, actually want to engage. And I can't remember a class that's generally the case, is just a high level representation of how much students want to learn and engage with learning in the immediate sense, but also apply that learning to the lives they want to live.
As a college student, a senior, I think there's a lot of that, like, college students are just lazy these days. We've talked about that in depth. College students are just different. They don't want to learn anymore. They don't care. They just want to party. They want to do. I haven't been to a party in years. I'm not the party. We've talked about that. I'm not the sorority person. I'm not the, this party thing. And I think that's very similar with a lot of other students, is that they're like, they do actually want to engage. And you can tell the engagement levels from somebody like your class and versus other classes, no names, but but you can see that difference. I think that's very true. I am running out of time. I have about 3 minutes left. So if there's
Yeah.
anything that you would say to anyone getting interested into the field of sociology, maybe they're in an undergrad program or just starting a graduate program and still don't really know what they want to do, what would you say the best advice is?
I'm going to stick to the undergraduate frame. Um, and I'm going to leave my big advice is like sociology is a fantastic major that leads to almost any type of job you could ever possibly want. That is a good thing and that is a bad thing. It's scary and dangerous that we don't have a clear-cut path to a clear-cut career. And so there is this sense of like, oh my gosh, what would I do with this degree? Oh my gosh, I really want to study this, but my parents don't. Oh my gosh, I really want to study this, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to have a livelihood as an adult. And that's the bad news. The good news is with careful consideration, with mentoring, with a little bit of diligence on the part of the student, like you can go into policy, you can go into law, you can go into marketing, you can go into education or anything possible. Is like sociology makes you smarter and better, period, full stop. It
I like
doesn't do it
that.
on its own
Sociology
though.
makes you smarter.
Period, full stop. Smarter, more
Period.
interesting, period, and full stop. Unfortunately, it doesn't do it on its own. And that means that some of the burden, a lot of the burden is shifted to students to try to figure out how to make that case to employers, etc.
I agree. No, I need that on a bumper sticker now. Sociology makes you smarter, period. Oh, I love it. I'm more than happy to have you chat again in the future. Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Stuber.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.